This is episode 542 of The Journey, podcast of Texas Baptist in Espanol, where we have a conversation on leadership, culture, and creativity. My name is Vidal, and we are on part two of what we have called Four Churches, One Gospel. And this is the conversation that came out of, some research studies and within COVID this last year, and even before, the studies on what is taking place among Spanish-speaking churches, English-speaking churches, but specifically those who are affiliated to Texas Baptist en Español. And one of the common distinctiveness that we're facing today, even as we are trying to come back into some sort of a normalcy in the life of the church, is exactly the need of pastors. Whether it's churches that have lost a pastor, churches that are actually searching for a pastor, churches that are transitioning in leadership, whatever the case may be. This past Sunday, we had the privilege as a family between my wife and my three kids, of being in four different churches. And the service, the ministering, the involvement in those churches, it has to do because we're going through this transition of empty nesting, where our kids are moving gradually, relocating to other places, and kind of just gave us that sense of okay, so we were at four different churches. We obviously for the last 20 plus years been able to serve at a specific church because my background is local pastor, and for the last 30 years I've been able to serve the local church in different roles and specifically pastoral ministry. But within last Sunday, just transitioning and seeing the diversity, the uniqueness of firstborn, middle child, and then our youngest, we have three kids, and then the uniqueness of Areli and myself being so opposite personality-wise, and just the fact that she is female, I'm a male, all this kind of a uniqueness and diversity, when you have the centrality of one gospel that allows you to celebrate that uniqueness of every individual, not because we are better or just because we are unique, but because the uniqueness is really experienced in its entirety when we submit to that understanding of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, apparently 2,000 years ago, as we said yesterday, that was a major challenge, that tragically the roles were kind of reversed. So we found the issue 2,000 years ago that instead of submitting to the lordship or to the centrality of the gospel, the lordship of Jesus, tragically the churches 2,000 years ago, they were exalting their uniqueness, their diversity. And this is what we call self-inflicted pain, because anytime that you placed or you try to put anything above the character, the person of Jesus, it becomes idolatry. And it becomes self-inflicted pain because then, again, self-indulgence, self-exaltation, marginalization, racism, you name it. It's all this labeling each other. That's the result of disregarding Jesus and then placing something or someone above the person of Jesus, or at least trying to. So I don't think you can actually do it, but at least trying. Well, in that context is that Paul, and this is from yesterday, Paul spoke to the Colossians because they're going through that experience of simply being confused on what they were supposed to do and what they were supposed to be. And as a result, because their confusion, they allowed the infiltration of doctrines and sects and cults that they were opposed completely to the supremacy of Jesus. So Paul bringing that admonition in Colossians chapter 1 on verse 18. Again, this is from yesterday. We spoke and said that he is the head. Again, we went through the in-depth, detailed explanation of this verse. So I'm not going to repeat all of that, but I'm just going to give you kind of the over view or arching purpose of this conversation that Paul is bringing into the admonition, into the correction, also the nurturing and hoping for the restoration of the church into the centrality of Jesus. He says he is the head, not you, the head, you are the body. So apparently this component of the church, we said yesterday, is within the context of that community, and that community is something that happened to the church. I'm going to say that again. That community That sense of unity is not something that the church achieves. It's something that the head has achieved. And because Jesus modeled, Jesus, again, restored and united everything to him, the church is able to become the church because of Jesus. Not necessarily because simply the church understands, not because the church has the right leadership, not because the church actually has the, kind of a commonality on doctrine and philosophy of ministry. All of those things are important, and you need to have those things, but they need to be the result of, again, the headship of Jesus. Well, the implication is that, again, Paul goes into the detail that he's the beginning and he is the firstborn among the dead. And then we closed yesterday by reminding everyone that the purpose of all this is that in everything he might have the supremacy. So this is kind of at the bottom line on that. So what we said from yesterday, again, just coming in because today I want to speak about church membership and kind of at the implications. What does this actually look like in the search for a pastor, in the understanding of coming back and reopening the church, the understanding of children's ministry and youth ministry, and what do you do? How do you go about it? This supremacy of Jesus, if verse 18 has the implications, the urgency for the church 2,000 years ago to reconnect, to reconsider, because apparently they were not they were not experiencing, they were not preaching, teaching, and structuring themselves with the understanding of headship coming from Jesus, that ultimately is the supremacy, the sovereignty of Jesus. The implication is that as churches search for pastors, as churches transition in leadership, as pastors are thinking or rethinking the role of ministry, it has to begin with what Jesus said about himself. This is what we described yesterday as Christology. This Christology, not what the church believes about Jesus, but what Jesus believes about himself, that hoping, relating to verse 18, reflects on how the church aligns or submits to the beliefs of Jesus. That's what we are saying by Christology, is basically that the person of Jesus is reflected on the mission of Jesus. Again, I'm using the word logos or the study of the mission. And the mission in this case is that lifestyle, that worldview of Jesus for 33 years. What is it that Jesus came, not only what Jesus was, and that's Christology, but what Jesus did. And the combination of both, ultimately, as churches are trying to move into the next phase, the combination of both on the character of Jesus, but also the deeds of Jesus, the works of Jesus, the mission of Jesus, when you bring those once again back into one single experience, which my understanding is that that's exactly the gospel. The gospel is not only what Jesus is, but also what Jesus did, because the deeds of Jesus, the works of Jesus, the 33 years of lifestyle and worldview is the result of his character, who he said he was. When you put them together, that's when you get now the definition of ecclesiology, what the church is supposed to also be and do. Tragically, what we're going to find, and this is where I guess I want to spend the next few minutes and close our time for our podcast today. Tragically, what we have done because of the lack of verse 18 of chapter 1 of Colossians, and if you want to read the entire book of Colossians, I think that's the centrality of the book, is the supremacy of Jesus, is the clarity of who Jesus is and who Jesus said he was. That's the confusion back 2,000 years ago. When that confusion becomes normative, when that confusion about who Jesus said he was and what Jesus did, when that confusion becomes, and no one has a problem with that confusion, because I think that's exactly where we are. I think the problem for the local church is not the lack of a pastor. The problem for the local church is not the fact that we were shut down and we're trying to reopen. I think the issue for the local church is Jesus, is the character of Jesus, is the supremacy of Jesus. When that happens, if you look at the screen, for those who are watching this podcast, if you look at the screen, the implication of confusion within the character and the deeds of Jesus is that we reverse the order that is on the screen. Instead of beginning with what Jesus said about himself, and instead of moving into what Jesus did, we tragically begin with ourselves. We begin with our personal preferences. We begin with our views of how we're supposed to call a pastor. How do we supposed to do children's ministry, youth ministry, or any other ministries? How we do missions? How do we do ecclesiology? Who we are, where we're supposed to go. So anytime that you begin with yourself, by default, what happens is that now yourself or ourselves as a community, church or marriage or whatever organization you're looking at, we define what we're supposed to do, because eventually we have redefined who God is supposed to be. And that's where the danger is. Apparently 2,000 years ago, that was a major problem. Anytime that you reverse this, you are asking for trouble. 2,000 years ago, the trouble was Gnosticism. The trouble was a lot of this false teaching and false doctrine, which tragically is one of the distinctiveness of the Church of Jesus 2,000 years later. So what do you do about it? Well, what you do is, once you settle this issue, and hopefully this, what you see on the screen, hopefully it becomes not just kind of a diagnosis to recognize that that's exactly where we are, and that's potentially our, condition. So let's just deal with this at a biblical doctrinal level before we speak of structure, or in this case, calling a pastor or transitioning leadership, whatever the case may be. If you're a pastor, and potentially looking for a church, I will definitely spend at least, this is just my personal kind of a recommendation, at least a month, at least 3 Sundays, 4 Sundays, if possible, on teaching, preaching to that potential church that you want to pastor, on what this looks like, and again, doctrinally, philosophically, and then eventually you get into the application, which is what I want to do today when it comes to membership. Once we settle that Christology defines missiology, and missiology definitely with Christology describes it and puts a definition of ecclesiology, what the church is supposed to be. Now let's talk about the unity among ourselves, and this is where church membership has to be filtered through the concept of family, because that's the language the Bible is going to use. A while ago, it was the head, the body. Paul is going to come back and interchangeably move from this terminology, which you got to remember, a lot of these terms that we're using, family, headship, body, children, all of that, we got to remember that this is the way that the Bible is going to kind of bring this theological, doctrinal, in-depth understanding of the character of God, Christology, the work of God, missiology, and then eventually ourselves, into bringing the language into the lower shelf, so to speak, so we can fully understand what is happening. So church membership, I know the word membership is a little challenging to process today because of the baggage or the preconceived ideas of membership. And typically we look at membership as something that potentially we have to, belong to. Again, you think of Netflix, you think of belonging to some sort of agency, organization, and tragically that mindset has translated, because I'm going to say this once again, once this is reversed and we put ecclesiology on the top instead of a Christology, once this is reversed, membership becomes something that we feel that we have to do, that we have to belong to. And this is where we tragically see membership as a self-indulgence, as a loophole for me to exercise my rights. Because remember, since I begin with myself, so church, life, marriage, finances is about what I want, is about my personal preferences, my theology, my understanding, my experience, my testimony. And this is why church is not working out, because this is exactly the opposite. I mean, we just read from Colossians. This is about Jesus being the head. So this is not about what you want and I want. This is about what Jesus wants. And again, I'm gonna say this briefly because I think it's important. For anybody to want what Jesus wants. I'm going to say this again. For anybody that wants what Jesus actually wants or wanted, the mind, the desires of Jesus, it begins with the supernatural experience of regeneration. If the person is not saved in Jesus Christ, it's impossible that you're going to desire what Jesus desired. Because number one, for you and I to know what Jesus wants, you have to know Jesus. You just cannot read or get some sort of a lecture or teaching about what Jesus wants. This is something that you get to know in the concept of intimacy. I can illustrate that in so many ways, between raising children, between marriage, between relating to elderly parents. It's in the concept of relationship that you get to see what people want. If you are not a follower of Jesus, I mean, this is where we got to come back into this understanding of the church. The church is based on Christology and ecclesiology, meaning in other words, every sermon, every preaching, every teaching, every opportunity that we have to convey the gospel, it has to be centered on the person of Jesus, what Jesus said about himself, and the works of Jesus, what Jesus did for 33 years. And when I use the language of 33 years, obviously I'm seeing the crystallization. I'm bringing the conversation that this works of Jesus, this lifestyle, this worldview of Jesus is simply the expression of the mindset of God before the creation of the world. Is the redemptive, eternal plan of God becoming flesh, walking among us. So every single sermon, every single teaching, every single communication of the gospel has to begin with that verses. And here's where I have to, again, I guess I need to break down this podcast into because otherwise it's going to become so lengthy. If we continue this crazy idea, which is not working, I'm going to say this again, is not working, that preaching is about what the church is supposed to do versus what Jesus has done. When preaching is based on imperatives, the church obeying, the church going, the church giving, the church sacrificing, the church, and I'm saying the church, but it can be the family, it can be the youth, it can be the children, the elderly, whatever. See, sermons, preaching, the Bible, the scriptures, the gospel always begins with the indicatives, with what Jesus did. And based on what he did, now we operate, now we go, now we give, now we sacrifice, now we forgive, now we love, now we do everything that we're supposed to do. But tragically, most sermons are based on what the church is supposed to do, how the church is supposed to reopen, how the church is supposed to, and on and on. And it's all this moralistic, therapeutic deism coming from this sociology Smith that came up with that term, and I was like, again, it's just not working. It wasn't working 2,000 years ago. It's not working today. So what do we do? Once again, we have to make sure that when it comes to church membership, it's not something that we have to do. When it comes to water baptism, it's not something that we have to do. When it comes to the concept of, again, giving, sacrificing, tithing, whatever the case may be, in this concept of membership, it's not something that we have to do. It's something that we get to do. And we get to do because of this doctrinal statement that we just made. Now, again, this is the concept of family, because the Bible presents this understanding of public or communal life literally holistically, meaning that is merged with the understanding of personal life. And this is why family is the terminology of the intimacy of whether it's marriage or raising children, taking care of the elderly, whatever the case may be. It's also the same concept in the sense of membership. Again, if or since the goal of everything that we just explained has to do with the bottom of the page, Christ likeness, the preamble in the concept of community. The preamble is exactly the diminishing of personal preferences. Church membership should be the training grounds for us to exercise the supernatural ability to lose, to give in, to disregard personal preferences. Because I want you to just dream with me. Dream with a generation of men and women in the context of community, because he is the head, we are the body. Remember this concept of family, the body of Jesus. Dream with me with a generation of men and women that this becomes the win. Christ likeness, Christology, missiology becomes the win. And what happens in the process of walking into Christ likeness, which is basically the process of sanctification, the mind of Jesus, not just being positioned in Jesus, but also possessing Jesus, becoming like Christ. Can you imagine? Because see, this is what's going to happen, is that you're going to have a generation that is going to gradually, radically give in, again, yield into personal preferences. Because I want you to translate that not only in the life of the church, but also in the life of family. Because again, this is kind of a one single package, right? There's no private life. There's no public life. It's all integrated. It's holistic. And this is why I'm inviting you as you search for a pastor, as you think about your church. Hopefully, no one is thinking about giving, moving away from the church, giving up on the church. I hope and you understand that the call to Christ likeness is a call that can only be experienced in the concept of family. There is no way I can grow in Christ likeness if this is the win. We can do this on our own. It's a contradiction of terms. I don't have the time to get into details, but I hope and you can go into the scriptures and search a little bit more on that. The reason why is because this is where the God of the Bible exercises and again exemplifies and crystallizes the understanding of covenantal relationships. This is the way. God is not just sovereign on how he saves the world, but he's also sovereign on the means that he uses, how he chooses to relate, to unsaved people and saved people, to those who potentially can be saved and those who are currently saved. God chooses to relate to everybody in the concept of covenant, in the concept of relationship based on covenants. Church membership is where we are able to exercise that ultimately permeates and illustrates how a young person eventually dates and eventually gets married. How do you deal with work-related issues, in that understanding that this is not about me, so personal preferences are given into, are yield into the experience in that concept of relationships, and then hopefully translates into how we do life holistically. Well, this relationship that we do have among ourselves is with God and also with one another. I'm going to say this one more time. The God and each other is really, they're almost like synonyms in a sense that they have to be, because again, the holistic view of life, this is something that is integrated. And I'm saying this because we tragically have a generation that not only begins with ecclesiology instead of Christology, begins with the church instead of Jesus. And tragically, the mission of Jesus is optional or non-existent. When that happens, these two things right here on the screen, the God and each other, are tragically divorced. And this is where we set ourselves up for failure, because instead of having a covenantal relationship with the church, with the body of Jesus, we see it contractual. We see it as in what's in for me. I'm going to go and seek the church that benefits or has the programs that benefits me, instead of understanding that if Christ likeness is the win, then my salvation, my experience of regeneration, my experience of headship of Jesus over my life, my family, is for the purpose of the health of the church. That this is about the church. This is about the eternal plan that was established before the foundations of the world, and that God chose his people, the body, to communicate, to be the vehicle to convey this message. This is why when it comes to that concept of seeking for a pastor, searching for a pastor, my suggestion, pastors, as we search for a church and as we are praying and maybe going through interviews, going through whatever processes or logistical things we go through, I really believe that this is where we settle, we establish these principles in a manner that allows us to understand that we are not called to do this on our own. I guess for me, the best way to illustrate, and this is one of my favorite pictures of pastoral ministry when I had the privilege to baptize people, as this young lady is coming out of the water on water baptism. This is exactly what I mean by covenantal relationship. That this is a covenant that is made through the understanding that the same way that Jesus was chosen, predestined, elected to be the cornerstone of the building, the cornerstone. The Bible says, this is from 1 Peter, that we were also chosen, elected, predestined to be living stones. He's the cornerstone and we're joining him. But this is where baptism comes into place, because again, obviously, you're talking about the edifice, the building that is being built, right? Well, Jesus is the cornerstone and Jesus builds the building. But one of the things that is shocking for me was, and is still, and is for most of us, is that since Jesus is the cornerstone, is the foundation, is the unshakable, rock where God has chosen and has determined about the building, and he has made us these living stones. If that's the case, or since that is the case, I want to hear this clearly, is that the same election is applicable to the understanding that now the election is not just for Jesus to be the cornerstone, but also to be rejected by the builders. So apparently, the privilege to be the cornerstone and to be rejected go hand in hand. What am I saying? That's all that I'm saying. In water baptism, as we have been chosen and we have opened up this, responded to this relationship of salvation, our election, our choosing, our being a part united with Jesus, we are united also in the suffering, in the rejection. And this is why when it comes to, again, the concept of church membership is in the concept of this covenantal relationship, that now for us, in the concept of a community, he is the head, we are the body, in the concept of community, in the concept of real churches, not just ideal churches, in that concept, when suffering shows up, when the unthinkable becomes tangible in a reality, this is where we understand that the way that we're going to deal with this is in community. The tragedy of COVID-19 and the tragedy of a lot of difficulties and irreversible experiences has been for many Christians that tragically their relationship with the church was superficial, wasn't deep enough to understand these biblical principles, that when we get hit by this unthinkable, when we get hit by the rejection of the builders, so to speak, that we're making reference, we're facing those things by ourselves. We see God as someone who disappointed us, someone that is not really sovereign, who is not really God. I mean, you go into so many directions, and that because of, again, the isolation, the loneliness of doing ministry. The recommendation, the invitation on a Thursday like this is simply for us to remind ourselves that this experience of covenantal relationships as a church, we are united not only with Christ in the understanding that He's cornerstone, we are living stones, but we are also united with Him in the rejection. Jesus' rejection by the builders 2,000 years ago, Jesus' exposure, Jesus' crucifixion was predestined, was established as part of God's redemptive, eternal plan of salvation. Coming to be a part of the body of Jesus includes, is part of the understanding, is that we have also been chosen to be a part of that rejection. Peter is going to close that conversation reminding us that if or when we go through the deepest of sorrow and tragedy, and when we lose a pastor, when we go through confusion, when leadership is questionable, when you may feel disappointed because of church leadership, of the lack of leadership, whatever you may find yourself, Peter wants to make sure that this is the case 2,000 years ago to the churches that were in this experience of being dispersed. This is 1st and 2nd Peter. He wants to make sure that when that happens is the result of Christ's likeness, that the persecution, the suffering, the tragedy is the result of walking in the light of Jesus Christ versus self-inflicted, versus a generation of men and women that instead of beginning with Christology and missiology, they began with ecclesiology. They began with themselves. They began with their personal preferences. They began with their understanding, with their own personal biases and wisdom and whatever the case might be. So hopefully today, as you move into what is almost the weekend, you and I, we are reminded that the Jesus that was chosen, elected, predestined to be the chosen one, to be the cornerstone, we get to be a part of that by becoming living stones through Jesus Christ. But we were also chosen. He was also chosen. He was predestined. He was established to also be rejected. The suffering, the rejection of Jesus is what brings salvation into your life, which I hope and pray that you are a part of the community of Jesus. I do hope and pray that you have a wonderful Thursday, and we'll see you guys tomorrow. God bless.